Okay, guys, I know this lecture is a little bit late. I had to recover from my voice. But today I'm going to talk about Mexico. This is a case study for AP Comparative Government and Politics. So just like we talked about in the last video with Nigeria, you want to be able to talk about each of the 6 countries that we're studying for comparative government. You need to be able to look at the data and draw conclusions about level of development in Mexico. You can see the land area is quite large, population's quite large. It's about almost 81% urbanized. Life expectancy, as usual, we see females higher than males. Literacy rates, males slightly higher than females. Some other things we want to look at is the HDI, 74 out of 189. GDP, remember the most accurate one is going to be GDP per capita, and that's around 8,000. Internet users, roughly about 66%. And believe it or not, Mexico is ranked 9 out of 229 states and territories. Freedom House rating, partially free. We also have corruption perception ranking at 130 out of 180. That is not good. We're going to talk about why people feel that way in Mexico. And for Fragile States Index, or the Failed State Index, the classification is warning. And then we want to also look at the Gini Index, which we know is the coefficient which measures inequality. Political map of Mexico. As you can see, the states closer to the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, seem to be a lot larger. And if you remember from history, this area was the frontier. It was the edge of, at one time, the Spanish Empire. So it was not as settled. The further you go south, especially towards the Federal District of Mexico, you're going to see that the states are fragmented. They're a lot smaller. So Mexico is a democracy. Let's start with that. It is also a middle income country, but it does face internal challenges, especially from drug cartels. But that is not Mexico's only story. And that's what one of the things I want to point out. So a question you want to think about is, how do people's perceptions of Mexico differ from Mexico's status as a democratic middle income country? So just think about the things that you've heard about Mexico and what a lot of people focus on. So sources of power and authority, and I'm going to go over a brief history of Mexico. I'm going to talk about Mexico's democratization, federalism, as well as legitimacy and challenges to the state. So, brief history, I already mentioned this. Mexico was colonized by Spain. Following independence in the early 1800s, Mexico became a dictatorship. And the Mexican Revolution in the early 1900s led to the creation of the modern Mexican state. And so a democratic constitution was adopted in 1917. One of the key things to point out on your exam is that Mexico was ruled by the PRI, or PRI party, until the year 2000. That means Mexico was a one-party state for over 80 years. So a key word we need to talk about is patron clientelism. So the PRI party embraced the democratic constitution, yet they formed an authoritarian regime, which those things, they don't fit together just right. And that's what creates a liberal democracy or a hybrid democracy. And so, correction, that was 70 years, not 80 years, 71 to be precise. How did the PRI maintain power for so long? Through corruption, bribery, intimidation, also voter tactics like trying to prevent people from voting or getting people to vote illegally, as well as patron clientelism, which I'll talk about in a second. They also used oil wealth, trade with the U.S. to industrialize, and transform Mexico into a middle income country. So when you talk about the party, it's not all negative. There was some positive in terms of development. So patrons, when we use that word, we're talking about those in power, and clients are the citizens. So those in power offer benefits to clients in exchange for political support. So it's kind of like a, quid pro quo. You do for me, I do for you, right? Scratch my back, I scratch your back. Eventually, Mexico privatized state-owned corporations, and because of this, the government officials did not have as much resources to bribe people with, and because of that, there's also a smaller amount of government jobs, since they don't need all those workers for the state-owned corporations, and that means less supporters overall. So we're going to talk about FDN as well as INE. So when the PRI shifted away from focusing on the rural poor, they began to favor a free market economy. So at first it was the party of the revolution, right? You think about, Mexico's revolution. This was a social and economic revolution, because the independents did not fulfill all the elements of a revolution, and that's why 100 years later you had another revolution. So the party starts out by focusing on the rural poor, but over time it moves more towards free market economy and less regulation, and this kind of created a new party called the National Democratic Front. In 1988 election in Mexico, FDN garnered about 30% of the vote in a race that both the PAN party, which is the conservative party, and the PRI party were running candidates. However, there were many claims of electoral fraud. So make sure 1988 election, the PRI party's going to win. They're going to win every election up to just right before 2000. And they start losing popularity, and they start using even more voter tactics and fraud. So the PRI knew that they had to do something or they were going to be rejected. And so they started to enact policies for freer and fairer elections. In 1990, they established the Federal Electoral Institute, also called the National Electoral Institute, to oversee the elections. In other words, they finally gave in and decided that yes, we're going to be willing to lose an election. So democratization. After the 1994 election, one-party rule declined and was now replaced with a three-party system. Because of this, in the 2000 election, the PAN candidate, which PAN is the conservative party, the candidate for that party, Vicente Fox, is elected. And citizens gain trust in elections. They realize you can vote and somebody can win from another party. In 2018, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, he's known as AMLO, he ran an anti-corruption campaign, and he represented the Morena party, and it's also known as the National Regeneration Movement. And this showed the change of power between parties. In other words, it wasn't just going to be PRI and the PAN party, but also you were going to have you have other new players as well, like the Morena party. When we talk about federalism, you need to know that Mexico's constitution established a federal system, and federalism has strengthened since the year 2000. It was weak under the pre-party because of, like I mentioned, the one-party state. But when it strengthened, that means states gained power. States are receiving more revenue from the national government, and they're generating more revenue on their own. Previously, states would be punished for not following central directives, and that would help reinforce the power of a one-party state. Corruption and human rights abuses plague some state government as well. So, speaking of the states in Mexico, there are 31 states plus Mexico City. And state governments consist of a governor and a unicameral legislature. So, what are sources of legitimacy for Mexico's government? That's the Constitution, which establishes the 3 independent branches, as well as the INE, which we talked about as an electoral regulatory commission or organization, and having freer and fairer elections, as well as economic performance and some challenges. So legitimacy is undermined by clientelism, which I mentioned earlier, corruption, violence, and human rights abuses, which I'm going to talk about in just a bit. So the Iguala massacre in 2014, the disappearance of 43 male students who were actually training to be teachers. They were from a rural college in southern Guerrero. They disappeared when they went on a bus to go to the protest. They were going to a protest to protest against discriminatory hiring practices. On their way back to their rural village, the municipal police, the city police, opened fire on the bus. The reason the police gave for firing on the bus full of teacher trainees was they believed that the bus had been hijacked by these teachers. We do know that 3 died, but it is unknown what happened to the 43 other teachers. In 2019, President AMLO created a truth commission to investigate the massacre, and that's when they were able to identify the remains of 3 of the students. You can see from the image here, it says Los 43 Donde? They want to know where the 43 people went. Human rights groups claim several state governments violated basic human rights. All right, institutions of government. So the 3 branches, your executive, legislative, and judiciary. Introduction to institutions of government. So Mexico has a presidential system of government. This means that the Mexican president is both the head of state and the head of government. The Mexican Constitution creates a system of checks and balances through, separation of powers and the checks and balances, because there are 3 branches. The Mexican president does have a significant amount of power, and democratization has increased checks on presidential power. The executive branch. So again, I already said Mexico's president is both head of state and head of government. Mexican president appoints cabinet heads who are subject to Senate confirmation. The president's also commander-in-chief, and Mexico's president can veto legislation and issue decrees that have force of law. So again, an important tip for your AP exam, you want to say that in a presidential state, the roles are fused, is the word you want to use. Remember, head of state is the symbolic representation of a country, and head of government is the key executive in the policy-making process. That is the person who is doing the day-to-day business in government. So, the executive over time. Since PRI had control of legislative and judicial branches, there were very little checks on the executive branch. Since the end of one-party dominance, the president faces a divided government. It became more difficult to pass policies. Judiciary is also gaining independence, and the Mexican president is facing more checks but is still very powerful. And that's how democracy is supposed to work. The role of the president. Powers include, as I mentioned, appoint cabinet heads, commander-in-chief, sign or veto laws, and issue decrees. Some limits include the sexenio, which is a 6-year term. In other words, the president cannot run for election again. It's one and done. Another limit includes that it's hard to impeach the president, and Article 108 can remove the president for treason. So first I'm going to talk about the former Mexican president, López Obrador. He is from the Morena party, which actually is his party. He founded this party. It is a leftist party. In the 2018 election, AMLO won more than 50% of the votes. We call that a mandate, right? In other words, more than half of the people vote for him. That means that he is very popular. He was lax on corruption prosecution. He criticized the media. He liked using the phrase fake news, for example. He suggested a government-run social network, which would be more similar to something you find, for example, in China or in Russia. He increased the size of the military and deployed troops to battle the cartels. He was criticized for the handling of COVID-19. He wasn't as open to the science behind the virus. Critics believed his charismatic leadership is undoing checks and balances. In other words, people liked him so much because how he spoke and who he was, that they were willing to overlook negative characteristics because they really liked him. And that allows him to garner more power. So I want to talk about Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo. So a little background about her. She's Mexico's current president. Her background is in environmental engineering, and she was a researcher at the Institute of Engineering at UNAM. She focused on energy, the environment, and sustainable development. What we do know is from 2000 to 2006, she served as the Secretary of the Environment of Mexico City. And in 2007, she shared the Nobel Prize for Peace along with U.S. Vice President Al Gore, as well as others, for their work on the IPCC report. IPCC stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. From 2015 to 2017, she was mayor of Tlalpan and oversaw the introduction of the Metro bus system. From 2018 to 2024, she was mayor of Mexico City, and she was the first woman in this position. She was also the first Jewish person in this position. And as well, she was the first woman and the first Jewish person to be president-elect, and finally to be elected president in 2024 for the Morena party. I'm going to back up a little bit. When she was mayor of Tlalpan, she focused on water rights and fair usage. As mayor of Mexico, she focused on expanding rainwater collection, and she also planned to overhaul the subway system. She is very close to the former president AMLO. She's seen as his ideological successor, but she does oppose his governance with the petroleum industry, and instead she is pushing for nationally subsidized renewable energy. And, that's connected to her background. The legislative branch. So Mexico's legislature is bicameral, and this is at the national level. Chamber of Deputies is the lower house, and the Senate is the upper house. Chamber of Deputies has power to debate and pass legislation, levy taxes, approve the budget, and certify elections. And the Senate has the power to confirm appointments, ratify treaties, and approve federal intervention in the states. Again, so the lower house is typically more members, shorter terms, less prestige, but can be more powerful. The upper house typically has fewer members. It might have more prestige, could have less power. Chamber of Deputies is the elected lower house. They pass legislation, levy taxes, approve the budget, certify elections. And the Senate is the elected upper house, confirm appointments, ratify treaties, approve federal intervention in the states. And so from this slide and the slide before, I was more general. And then in this slide, I was more specific with examples from Mexico. Here is the summary visual that shows the relationship of the branches of the Mexican federal government and the powers of the branches. So when you're looking at this, this is division of power and responsibilities. You can see it's color-coded by legislation. You have your legislative branch. You have your, that's going to be in the orange color. You have your executive branch, that's in the green, and your judicial, which is in yellow. And then you can follow the arrows to try to figure out who is checking who and how this creates a balance. So this summary on this one shows how each institution is elected or appointed. So on the left, where it says Congress, Senate, there are 128 senators. 64 from plurality votes, and it is 2 per state. Remember, there's 31 states, but then there's also Mexico City, the federal district. So 31 plus 1 is 32, times 2, because 2 members per state, and that gives you the 64. Then there are 32 senators by runner-up seats. That's going to help candidates that are popular but maybe not as popular. 32 by proportional vote from party lists. This is really important. So the way that the party lists work is each party, like the Morena party, the PAN, the PRI, they have a list of potential candidates, and they have them like ranked, which candidate they prefer, how many years they've been in the party, what's their experience. So when they win the seats, they check their party list, and then they'll pick who's going to take those seats. And they serve a 6-year term, and they're allowed to have 2-term limits, so up to 12 years. The Chamber of Deputies has 500 representatives, and they 300 of them is from plurality vote using single member district, also known as first past the post, FPTP districts. And then the other 200 are from proportional votes from party list. But in this one, they require a 2% cutoff. So you have to have at least 2% of the votes. So, if you, random guy over here, random Joe, runs for office and he only gets 1% of the votes, he's not going to get any seats in the proportional vote. So they serve 3-year terms, and they're allowed 2-term limits. So that's a total of 6 years. And 40% of the candidates must be women. So if you look at the arrows of where they're flowing, blue arrow means approves. So the Congress, the Senate, approves the justices on the Supreme Court. The Congress also approves the cabinet members. And if you look at the center top, the president, which is looks like a green color, The president is elected through a direct national election, and remember, can only serve one 6-year term known as this sexennial. And you also want to look on the right at the Supreme Court, 11 justices appointed by the president, approved by Senate. They serve 15-year terms. That's important. They are not lifetime. And there's no reappointment. All right. Enfranchised people, that's the voters. That's in purple. The voters is towards the bottom because they're the base. They are required to have a national voter identification, and they get to vote for Congress and for the president. Then you have the INE, National Electoral Institute. The reason why the letters don't necessarily match the words is because when you translate it in Spanish, the words would be a little bit different order. So the INE oversees election appointed by Chamber of Deputies, and they serve a 9-year term. The Federal Electoral Tribunal certifies the election. There is no appeal. They are appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. So we followed the purple arrows, we followed the blue arrows. So the gray arrows are the veto power or the ability to repeal. So the Supreme Court has veto power on the legislative branch, and the president has a veto power on the legislative branch as well. So both of those can work to balance the power and to limit the power of the legislature. You have your orange arrow as well. I think I already went over that. That's the president with the Supreme Court because he appoints them. All right, judiciary. Supreme Court has the power of judicial review. That's important. Make sure you know that fact. Supreme Court justices are appointed by the president, confirmed by Senate for 15-year terms. Since democratization, the courts have become more autonomous and independent, even striking down executive action. If you're able to strike down something that the president did, that's pretty powerful. But corruption plagues some local courts still. So Mexico is what we call a fragile democracy. Reform of the judiciary could be the single most important issue as the rule of law is weak. So if you're writing an FRQ and it says to pick one of the AP6 countries and to explain which branch is the weakest and how it can be improved, for almost all the countries, you're going to want to say judiciary, and you're going to want to say that it needs to have more independence in order to make the rule of law stronger because it is weak. So if Mexico reduces corruption and further professionalize the courts, then the judiciary could become an equal co-branch, as powerful as the executive and as the legislature. Electoral system, political parties, and civil society. I'm going to talk about elections, political parties, and interest groups and social movements. So, civil society consists of groups outside of the government's control. In other words, they form outside of the government. Mexico encourages free and fair elections, party competition, and citizen participation. But actions by drug cartels have repressed civil society. Elections. President is elected by plurality of the vote. Although 50% is not needed, if they get the 50%, they can claim a mandate. In other words, that they are very popular and that people agree with their agenda or their mandate. The Chamber of Deputies is elected through a mixed system. As I mentioned earlier, 300 are chosen through SMD and 200 are chosen through PR. Senate represents the states and is selected through a mixed system. and 50% of candidates in single member districts and PR lists must be female. I know in a previous one I said 40%. We need to fact check if it's 40 or 50 now. One is new and one is old. All right, the pre-regime. So the sitting president, the way historically it happened was the president who was in power would choose his successor through a process called el dedazo. This strengthened authoritarian rule, that's the opposite of democracy, as citizens had no input over the next candidate. But in 1998, el dedazo ended with the start of party primaries, where party members would choose the nominee, not just the sitting president. The National Electoral Institute works to reduce voter fraud and has made elections more competitive. But in November 2022, President AMLO announced plans to overhaul electoral authority, which led to mass protests. He wanted to reduce the electoral budget and cut offices at the state level, and he did successfully do that, which reduces, the free and fair elections, because that's what an electoral institute does. They make sure, and if you cut like offices, and if you have an issue, right, or with voting, if there's an issue with voting machines, or claims of fraud, then there's not as many offices to handle that. So that decreases democracy. All right, election systems. So mixed electoral system, again, directly elected. 2 houses whose members are elected to the legislature, including SMD and PR. You have your SMD, which, as I mentioned, 300 member seats of Chamber of Deputies is elected through that system. Country divided into district with roughly equal population, and the word single is because each district elects 1 representative. Then you have your PR system, which is 200 seats of the Chamber of Deputies are elected using PR. Political parties earn seats according to the percentage of votes, as long as they meet the 2% threshold for 1 seat, and each party submits a list of candidates who will be placed in office. That question was highly missed on your last exam. So please study that. The Senate represents the states in Mexico's federal system with 128 members. I already did the math for you earlier. And 32 additional members are elected through PR system. Political parties. Mexico has a multi-party system. The PRI controlled politics until 2000. The PAN is a conservative party. PRD is a party on the left. And the Morena party split from PRD and won the presidency in 2018 with a populist appeal. And the Morena party also won the 2024 election. Interest groups and social movements. So Mexico was corporatist under the PRI, with single peak associations representing each important interest. What we have seen is, as Mexico democratizes, pluralism is replacing corporatism. Also, the Zapatista Rebellion was a social movement that challenged the states, and it called the world's attention to what was happening to the indigenous people. So those are the 2 things I'm going to talk about in this section. So let's start with corporatism. What is it? So corporatism is a system based on the idea that each important interest in society should be represented by one organization authorized by the government, known as a peak association. So, for example, let's say labor, right? Or peasants, right? So basically you take a popular group and you kind of lump them all into one. And that single one will be recognized by the government, and that's the one the government will talk to. In other words, you're not going to have 10 different labor organizations or 10 different, peasant, groups. They're going to be lumped together. So, under PRI rule, the government used state corporatism to control interest groups. In other words, if they didn't like the message your group was trying to get across, they would not recognize you. They're going to recognize the one that is most loyal to them and fits their agenda, or whatever they're campaigning. So over time, the corporatist system became corrupt, and it was controlled by the elite. So pluralism is replacing corporatism. Pluralism is democratic. Groups are allowed to form outside of government control. So maybe there's 500 labor groups, right? Even small groups can participate in policy-making process. And other examples include environment protection, teachers, journalists, and women. Because previously, if you just lump everybody together for labor, how are you going to represent all these smaller groups if you're putting them all into one group? All right, Zapatista Rebellion. So this rebellion happened in the state of Chiapas. This is actually the poorest state in Mexico. In the 1980s, national leftist organizations sent activists to build a secret armed group to Chiapas. They were preparing for a future rebellion in an unoccupied area that at one time was jungle. They wanted to turn the area into farms for indigenous people. So the group that was created was known as the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, or EZLN, with indigenous people being led by non-indigenous people from other parts of the country. So again, people who are not indigenous from other parts of the country, maybe even in the northern states, went to Chiapas, into a jungle area, cleared it, set up farms for the indigenous people. In 1993, the group battled the government as it was spurred by the passage of NAFTA. The controversy with NAFTA is it was going to require participating countries, which was Canada, Mexico, and the U.S., to not allow communal land ownership. And this is part, in Mexico, it was Article 17 of the Mexican Constitution, which protected ejido rights, which are communal lands ownership supported by the state. And the reason why the indigenous people had their land in common was because that was the indigenous practice. So, and if they end the ejido, that meant that indigenous land could be sold to wealthy people and will displace the indigenous people. In 1994, on January 1st, 2000, mostly indigenous people were wearing ski masks. They were armed rebels. They took control of cities. So eventually they went from armed rebellion to a social movement. They began focusing later, if you look on the right, for the overthrow of the government. They went from that to now focusing on indigenous rights and class-based inequality. So it's a call for social justice and for the end of the pre-authoritarian government. How did the government respond? They sent in 10,000 troops. And just 2 weeks later, the rebels returned to the jungle. And this standoff lasted for years. It almost ended in 1996, but the legislation was not approved by the legislature, and so protests broke out again. In 2000, the new president of the PAN party, Vicente Fox, approved some of the Zapatista demands after Mexico began the process of democratization. And the last serious clash between Zapatistas and the government and non-Zapatista militia was in 2014. Today, you're more likely to find this type of protest art, on the bottom left, showing their children how to read and women how to read. On the right, showing that the importance of their land, with the corn stalks in the back, with dignity and liberty. You can see that she has the handkerchief on and the bandana, and it says 1 de enero 1994, and that's the date I talked to you about. And then the woman on the right has the ski mask, paying respect to the original movement. Political culture and participation. So talking a little more about civil rights and civil liberties, as well as divisions in Mexico. So Mexico's democratic constitution guarantees basic rights to citizens. Mexico fosters a political culture where many citizens are active in politics. Mexico is still considered an illiberal democracy, and human rights abuses have been reported. Many Mexicans lack trust and confidence in their government. So, although civil rights and liberties are protected on paper, rule of law is weak. That's an area I mentioned earlier that the government can work on. Journalists and human rights activists face threats from drug cartels, and some have been targeted and killed. Military and police forces have been accused of violating civil liberties, including torture. And although the law protects women, they face violence and discrimination. So, just a reminder, what's the difference or similarity between civil rights and civil liberties? Civil rights is protection from discrimination, such as in voting, being part of an ethnic group, or a religious minority. Your civil liberties are freedom of expression, press, right to peaceably assemble, and this can include, topics of, on religion or access to the internet. Journalists report about police, drug cartels, and government corruption. And between 2000 and 2018, there were 148 journalists killed, plus 21 disappeared. Mexico is the third most dangerous country for journalists. So the government created federal protection mechanisms for human rights defenders and journalists. So what are the sources of abuse? As I said, police, drug cartels, even the military. Types of abuse include torture, such as sexual violence, disappearances, such as missing women, and threats of violence and discriminations, especially gender-based violence and homicide. Which states have the highest human rights violations? This is Baja California, Chihuahua, Colima, Guanajuato, Michoacan, Morelos, and Veracruz. In 2019, here's a list of mass killings. 14 killed at a family gathering, 26 killed at a bar, 13 killed during the arrest of El Chapo's son in Sinaloa, and 9 dual citizen Mormons were killed in Sonora, Mexico. Divisions in Mexico. So Mexicans share a strong sense of national identity. There are social cleavages along the lines of ethnicity, class, and language, and political cleavages divide citizens because of their political beliefs. Another divide you want to talk about is the north-south divide, a geographic divide. It is also an economic divide because the southern states are the poorest. 47% of poor people are in the south. 40% of people are poor in the south compared to only 12% in the north. Agricultural subsidies benefit the north more than the south. NAFTA and the USMCA, which is the updated agreement, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, made it difficult for southern farmers to compete. And again, the Zapatista rebellion highlighted regional inequality and rural poverty. In Chiapas, for example, 74% live in poverty, and efforts to redistribute wealth have failed. So divisions between indigenous people and mestizos. So mestizos are people of mixed Spanish and indigenous descent. There are 62 different indigenous languages, and ethnic classifications are remnants, which means leftovers, of the Spanish caste system, the castas, which was a color or racial hierarchy that placed the Spanish on a higher level. The Constitution protects the rights such as education, autonomy, and self-determination of indigenous people, and the government does not consult them on decisions regarding development and exploitation of raw materials. Indigenous groups have less access to healthcare and education, and this cleavage coincides with the cleavage between North and South, disparities in wealth, as I mentioned on the previous slide. Indigenous people face violence, and Indigenous women face high rates of racism, discrimination, and violence. All right, economic and social change and development. So I'm going to talk about 5 things in this section: globalization, the recent Mexican economy, social policies, shifting demographics, and Mexico in the future. So, globalization first. In the past, Mexico adopted protectionist policies. One of the popular protectionist policies is import substitution industrialization from 1940 to 1982. Are you going to describe ISI policies? High tariffs, right, is the main thing you want to write about. And the idea behind this is that if you have high tariffs, it's going to give incentive to encourage the growth of domestic manufacturing, because people will not want to pay to import foreign competition. And so the idea behind it is that it will help grow the domestic economy. Economic liberalism. So in the 1980s, Mexico liberalized its economy. These are economic policies that support the free market and reduce trade barriers. So that's opposite of ISI policies. Pemex is Mexico's nationalized oil company, which has been partially privatized. And make sure you also know that the word nationalized industry means it's a state-owned company controlled by the government. But as I mentioned, it's not fully owned by the government. Part of it is privatized. And globalization, the definition is the increased interconnectedness of people, states, and economies. You got to say all 3: people, states, economies. NAFTA reduced trade barriers between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. Here are some positive characteristics of NAFTA. That includes it eliminated most trade barriers, increased access to the U.S. market, and increased productivity through maquiladoras, which are factories along the U.S.-Mexico border, usually owned by foreign companies. Negative impacts. Marginal impact on employment. Inequality increased as the wealthy benefited from the new business opportunities. Wages dropped by 40%, minimum wage dropped by 70%, and since the year 2000, cheaper labor in China allowed growth. All right, I had a typo on that slide. The recent Mexican economy. In 2018, Obrador pledged to increase state control of the economy, build infrastructure, and increase salaries of key workers. This is a move away from economic liberalization. This is increasing the power of the federal government over the economy. In 2019, U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to impose tariffs to pressure Mexico to change its immigration policies. So let's talk about tariffs in 2025. I just updated this a couple days ago, so it's relevant. On his first day in office, U.S. President Trump announces 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada. By February 1st, that's of this year, 2025, Trump signed an executive order to impose tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, and he invoked this power, declaring a national emergency due to undocumented immigration and drug trafficking. 2 days later, he agrees to a 30-day pause when Mexico agrees to his border demands. On March 4th, the tariffs went into effect, and Mexican President Sheinbaum promised retaliatory tariffs, but then in an about-face, Trump paused some tariffs after speaking with U.S. automakers. The next day, Trump postponed additional tariffs on imports from Mexico, and he also gave credit to Sheinbaum, the Mexican president, but he still plans on enacting retaliatory tariffs on April 2nd, which is tomorrow. Some social policies. Abortion policy varies by state, but is illegal under federal law. You can see the picture on the left at a protest. The Prospera program was a conditional cash transfer program which gave families financial aid, which is money, in exchange for an agreement to send children to school. But this program ended in 2021, and it was not everywhere. It was in certain areas. Obrador claimed that the program facilitators were agents of political parties and that they were actually accepting bribes in exchange for medical care. Newly proposed policies include payments for finishing secondary school and universal old age pension. All right, here's a graph. It's the economy linked to democratic discontent. More than 80% of Mexicans are dissatisfied with the way democracy is working in the country. And the trend on this scatter plot graph is that better economic conditions lead to more support for democracy within a country. Shifting demographics. Northern Mexico is more prosperous due to access to U.S. markets. People are moving from south to north and from rural to urban areas, especially to Mexico City, which is what we call a primate city, because it is more than double the size of the second city, which is Guadalajara. Mexicans are moving legally and unauthorized to the United States. Unauthorized immigrants in the United States, here are some recent estimates in millions. Mexico in the future. Mexico's been a democracy since 2000. It has a lively civil society. There are challenges such as drug violence and corruption. Income inequality has increased since economic liberalization, and time will tell whether Mexico's democracy will further consolidate. All right, guys, have a good day.